So I'd like to begin by welcoming everyone back to the second day of this weekend compassion retreat based on the 4 immeasurables. And in this session, we're going to look at the last 2 of the 4 immeasurables, that is empathetic joy and equanimity. So we saw here that in compassion practice, the compassion wing of practice, the foundation of this are these 4 immeasurables, these 4 qualities that we are cultivating, the qualities of loving kindness, compassion, empathetic joy, and equanimity. Cultivating these to immeasurable living beings, in other words, all living beings. And yesterday, in conjunction with that, we looked at how to deal with anger and attachment, because these become as obstacles for these practice, particularly of loving kindness and compassion. And today, in the following 2 sessions, we'll build on that foundation of the 4 immeasurables with what's called the exchanging self with others approach or technique. In particular there, the Tonglen, the giving and taking practice. And in the last session today, how to integrate these various compassion practices into daily life. So let's see what we're going to be covering in this session. So as normal, we'll begin with a meditation. And the meditation we'll begin with is a follow-on from the last session yesterday where we looked at dealing with anger. And so in this meditation session, we're going to look at the disadvantages of anger. In other words, to first gain a clear understanding of what anger is and how it really leads to suffering, so that we then can develop the aspiration to eliminate anger. So that's what we're going to do in this meditation. Following that, we'll begin with a review of some of the main points we covered yesterday. Then we'll introduce the two qualities of empathetic joy and equanimity. We'll look at the actual practice that we're going to do in the session, which is the practice of empathetic joy. We'll do a guided meditation on that. And then some tips for the practice in terms of the 4 immeasurables practices. And then, as per normal, we'll finish with some Q&A. So let's begin with that meditation, reflecting on the disadvantages of anger, to get a clear understanding of anger, so then we can develop that aspiration to be free of anger. So if you'd like to find a nice, comfortable posture, let's begin. Allowing your awareness to descend into the body and simply become aware of sensations throughout the body. And if you notice any areas of tightness or tension in any part of the body, then use the out breath to relax and release that tightness or tension. And bringing your awareness to the area of your face, and soften and relax all the muscles in the face. The mouth and jaw soft and relaxed. And all the muscles around the eyes soft and relaxed. And in this way, allowing the entire body to become completely relaxed, completely at ease. And relaxing more deeply with each out breath. And with each out breath, letting go of any thoughts that may have arisen, happily releasing them. And simply allowing the mind to come to rest in the stillness of the present moment. Not doing anything at all, simply being present. Resting in stillness. So let's now have a look at anger and see what effect anger has on our life and those around us. So remember, anger is a mental affliction, and it sees its object as unattractive. It exaggerates the object's unattractiveness, and then thus wishes to harm the object. Why? Because anger believes that object is the source of our suffering. And so we can begin by reflecting on your own past experiences. So bring to mind some occasions when you were angry in the past, and see what effect did that anger have on you and those around you. And how did you feel when you were angry? Was your mind calm and relaxed, or was it agitated and tense? And what effect did anger have on your body? And how do you communicate with others when you're angry? Is your communication effective? Or does your anger ever cause you to exaggerate or distort the facts? And how do you act when you're angry? Does anger ever lead you to react aggressively? And does anger ever cause you to verbally or even sometimes physically attack other people? Or do you find that you sometimes try to suppress your anger? And if you suppress your anger and try to hold it inside, what does that feel like? And what effect does that have on the body? And when you're angry, what effect does your actions have on others? And does your anger bring about the happiness that you desire? And later, when you're calm, how do you feel about what you said and did when you were angry? Do you ever come to regret some of the things you said and did when you were angry? And how do you appear to others when you're angry? How do they see you? And does anger help promote mutual respect, harmony, and friendship? And so in conclusion, see that anger destroys both our own and others' happiness. And so then make a strong determination to catch it when it arises and to apply antidotes to overcome it, to eliminate it. And then release all appearances and allow the mind to come to rest in that inner purity of mind, which is free of anger. And we can bring the meditation to a close. Let's begin with a short review of some of the main points from yesterday. So we saw there yesterday that the two main wings of practice are wisdom and compassion, and that these two wings are based on the shamatha practice, that on the basis of a calm, clear, focused mind, we can then much more effectively develop wisdom and compassion. And we saw there that in terms of wisdom at the foundation level, we can talk about these three marks of existence, which we're going to look at in the next retreat. And then in the Mahayana Buddhist traditions, in addition to that, we go further in the wisdom practice into that wisdom of emptiness. And that'll be the main topic for the last of these series of 5 retreats. And then here in the compassion wing of practice at the foundation level, we are cultivating these 4 immeasurables: loving kindness, compassion, empathetic joy, and equanimity. And that in the Mahayana Buddhist traditions, they build on these 4 immeasurables in terms of bodhicitta. And we'll be looking at that shortly in the next session. And so with those first 2 of the 4 immeasurables of loving kindness and compassion, we had that very relevant quote from Shantideva: those desiring to escape from suffering hasten right toward their own misery. And with the very desire for happiness, out of delusion, they destroy their own well-being as if it were the enemy. In other words, we tend to have already a desire for happiness and a desire to be free of suffering. But because we don't know what suffering is and the causes of suffering, and we don't know what happiness is and the cause of happiness, then not only don't we find liberation from suffering and find happiness, but we usually induce a lot of unnecessary suffering instead. And so with that loving kindness, which is in Sanskrit Maitri and Pali Metta, we saw there loving kindness was the wish or aspiration for ourselves and others to have happiness and its causes. And so if we wish to cultivate that for ourselves and others, then we need to know what is happiness, what are the causes of happiness, and how do we cultivate those causes. And there yesterday we saw that we can talk about 2 types of happiness: the temporal happiness, or in other words, pleasurable experiences, and genuine happiness is state of inner well-being. And that if we mistake pleasure for genuine happiness, then all that happens is we end up with craving and attachment for our pleasant experiences. And then, as Shantideva says, out of delusion, we'll destroy our own well-being as if it were the enemy, that attachment, craving and attachment is just going to create suffering. So therefore, to appreciate there are these two types of happiness, and that we're really mainly striving for that state of genuine happiness, of inner well-being. And then at the same time, because we can then release the craving and attachment to the pleasurable experiences, because we'll realize they're never going to fulfill us and satisfy us, then we can actually enjoy our pleasurable experiences more than we do now. And then in terms of how to strive for that genuine happiness, inner well-being, we saw there that the causes of that are these three higher trainings of ethics, concentration, and wisdom. That on the basis of adopting an ethical lifestyle, we engage in the concentration practice, the shamatha practice, to develop single-pointed concentration. And then on that basis, we engage in the wisdom practice, or in other words, the vipassana practice, to gain a direct insight into the nature of reality, and thereby overcome our distorted view of reality, mental afflictions, and the suffering that they produce, and thereby be liberated from suffering and find, therefore, achieve that state of genuine happiness and inner well-being. So by knowing these things, then we can really start to cultivate loving kindness for ourselves and others. And similarly with compassion, which is karuna in Sanskrit and Pali, like loving kindness, compassion is not an emotion, it's an aspiration, it's a wish. Aspirational wish for ourselves and others to be free of suffering and its causes. And again, if we wish to cultivate compassion for ourselves and others, then we need to know again three things. We need to know what is suffering, what are the causes of suffering, and how do we eliminate those causes. Otherwise, compassion is just words with no meaning. And here we saw that suffering is much broader term than how we normally understand the word suffering. Of course, we wish to be free of unpleasant experiences, because that's how we normally understand suffering. But here in compassion, we are going much deeper than that. That at the deepest level, we are wishing to be free of having even the potential for suffering to arise in our life. And so that's the deepest meaning here of suffering, or in Sanskrit, the word is dukkha, this all-pervasive dukkha, that the human condition is such that there's always the potential for suffering to arise. And the reason we have that potential and the causes of suffering is the mental afflictions, particularly condensed down to these three poisons of ignorance, attachment, aversion, that due to the ignorance of not understanding nature of reality, of having a distorted view of reality, we end up with attachment to pleasant things, aversion to unpleasant things, and all the other mental afflictions come out of those. That's driving our behavior and resulting in our current situation of suffering. And so therefore, if we can understand these three things, and that we can overcome this distorted view of reality through the wisdom practice, the vipassana practice, then we can really start to cultivate compassion for ourselves and others. And so there we looked at this verse, a very well-known verse from this great Indian master Nagarjuna from the 2nd century, which he explains that process of how we achieve liberation from suffering. That he says, by extinguishing actions and mental afflictions, there's liberation. In other words, liberated from suffering, that finding that state of genuine happiness. And that actions and mental afflictions arise from misconceptions, and they come from elaborations, which is another word for ignorance, distorted view of reality. And that will cease through cultivating emptiness, this wisdom, realizing there's no independent me, no independent objective world. And so therefore, by realizing this, then we can really, again, cultivate compassion for ourselves and others, and then strive to overcome the causes of suffering, and thereby overcome suffering and achieve that state of genuine happiness and inner well-being. In terms of cultivating loving kindness and compassion, very much recommended to do that in stages. And here we added one extra stage at the beginning. So first we cultivate loving kindness and compassion toward ourselves, and then expand that out to first friends, then eventually strangers, to enemies, difficult people, and then eventually towards all living beings, which is immeasurable loving kindness and immeasurable compassion. And then also we looked at anger and attachment, these obstacles to the practice. And we saw with anger that it's defined as a mental factor that sees its object as unattractive, exaggerates the object's unattractiveness, and thus wishes to harm the object. So what we see here is this factor of exaggeration and distortion. And that's something in common with all mental afflictions because they're coming from this distorted view of reality. And because of that, mental afflictions exaggerate and distort. And we saw there are often some misconceptions regarding anger. That one was sometimes we think we need anger to deal with difficult situations. And what we saw there was that we don't need to resort to anger because anger exaggerates and distorts, and often then when we're in difficult situations and we allow anger to take control, we overreact and then don't often solve the problem but rather make it worse. So Buddhism recommends instead of that to practice patience, and that's another misconception we often have. We often feel that when it's recommended to practice patience, that simply means sit there and do nothing. Patience is not a behavior. Patience is a mental attitude. Patience is simply an undisturbed mind in the face of a difficult situation. So when Buddhism recommends that we practice patience, it's saying simply remain calm in the face of difficulties. Because if we can do that, we have a better chance of more accurately and clearly evaluating the situation and a better chance of responding more appropriately. And if we need to use force to respond, and sometimes we do, then we can use compassion. That compassion can be very forceful, and that actually anger is a sign of weakness and compassion is a sign of strength. Often people think it's the opposite. Again, compassion is not about sitting there smiling and saying nice things. And that's why often people think compassion is a sign of weakness, that if we do that, people will walk all over us. But of course, compassion is the wish or aspiration for ourselves and others to be free of suffering and its causes, which means if someone else is misbehaving, then the compassionate thing to do is to help them to overcome that negative behavior. And if necessary, we can use physical force to do that. And then here, to avoid cognitive fusion, that often the reason we get angry with people is we mistakenly fuse the person to their behavior and see them as a bad person, and then direct our rejection at the person. We attack the person, get angry at the person, rather to have a correct perspective and simply acknowledge there's a person doing a bad behavior, and therefore we can have compassion for the person and at the same time not tolerate their negative behavior and address that negative behavior. And similarly with attachment, we see in that definition that attachment also exaggerates and distorts. In fact, here exaggerating and distorting the attractiveness of the object, and thus wishes to possess and hold it. Because again, attachment is based on this distorted view of reality that sees the object or the person as existing independently of us. And therefore attachment believes because we're having a pleasant experience when we see that person or thing, that person or thing is actually the source of our happiness. So I want that person or thing, and that is attachment. And so we looked at dispelling some misconceptions there as well. One misconception is often that we need attachment to enjoy things. Actually, we saw there that attachment interferes with our enjoyment of things, that if we eliminate attachment or reduce attachment, we'll actually enjoy things more. Similarly, with a relationship, attachment interferes with our relationships, and if we reduce and eliminate it, we'll actually, our relationships will improve, because there are two dynamics in every relationship: the healthy one of loving kindness or love, the unhealthy one of attachment. If we can reduce that and increase the healthy one of love or loving kindness, our relationships will improve. And also, if we can reduce attachment and other mental afflictions, we'll actually become more creative. It will open up a space for creativity more easily to emerge from deep within our own mind. So they were the two mental afflictions we looked at yesterday. And we saw there that to be able to deal with these and other mental afflictions, first to have a clear understanding of them, what they are and how they lead to suffering, to develop the aspiration to be free of them. And together with that, to cultivate this view of genuine happiness. And that's something we'll be looking at in more detail in terms of Vipassana practice. Because as long as we see and believe that the source of my happiness and suffering is coming from out there, then of course we're going to have attachment to pleasant things, aversion to unpleasant things. Whereas if we can cultivate the view of genuine happiness and understand and appreciate the source of happiness and suffering is coming from within, then it's going to be much easier to deal with and eliminate, let go of attachment and anger. And then in terms of actually dealing with attachment, anger, and other mental afflictions, the first step is have mindfulness, is to notice these when they're first arising. Because if we can observe them as they're arising, we're free of them. They have no power from their own side to harm us, and they will simply dissipate. And we saw, in addition to simply having mindfulness, we can apply antidotes. Two classic antidotes we often find in many contexts in terms of many of the mental afflictions is the antidote of impermanence and the antidote of emptiness. And we briefly mentioned how to apply them yesterday. And we'll also be looking at those, of course, in much more detail in the context of the Vipassana retreats, the upcoming ones. And so then by practicing these sorts of things in meditation, then we can apply them in daily life to really help us to be able to deal with not only anger and attachment, but all mental afflictions. And so that brings us to the last two of the four immeasurables, empathetic joy and equanimity. So first, empathetic joy. In Sanskrit and Pali, this is mudita. An empathetic joy is the wish or aspiration for ourselves and others never to be separated from happiness. In other words, it's a rejoicing in our own and others' joys and virtues. And so this, particularly in the modern world, is very important because we tend to have this obsessive focus on the negative in the modern world and often with cognitive fusion. So we end up with a fixed, biased view of ourselves and others. So to help provide a balanced view of ourselves and others, we need to focus on the positives of ourselves and others. And that's what empathetic joy is all about. And here there's a nice quote I like from a modern day philosopher, William James, who says, "For the moment, what we attend to is reality." And so if we're always attending to negative things with respect to ourselves and others in the world, then of course that's all we're going to see. Just we're going to see negative, doom and gloom. But that's not the case. That's not reality. That's a distorted view because we're only focusing on the negative. So to have a balanced view, we need to focus on the positives of ourselves and others. Also here on the positive side, to avoid cognitive fusion. So on the negative, if we do cognitive fusion, generally that translates into getting angry at people, attacking people, or attacking ourselves. Similarly here, in terms of focusing on the positives, to avoid cognitive fusion, to not praise the person, because that will simply be a bit of an ego trip for them. Puff up their, maybe become very arrogant, thinking they're very superior. Rather, to praise the action that person does. Similarly, if we do something good, don't praise yourself, praise your behavior. And that will inspire you to continue to engage in that good behavior. So again, avoiding that cognitive fusion. Now, some obstacles to empathetic joy, again, in terms of near enemy and far enemy. So near enemy is something that seems like this rejoicing, and that is to have meaningless rejoicing, rejoicing in things which actually have no meaning, which is often simply getting caught up in our pleasurable experiences. Or even worse, starting to rejoice when we see other people suffer. So if we find ourselves falling into this meaningless rejoicing, then the antidote to that is loving kindness, to reflect on loving kindness, the wish or aspiration for ourselves and others to have that genuine happiness and its causes. And the far enemy, what is diametrically opposite to rejoicing, is jealousy or envy. And that's very common in the modern world. When we see other people do good things, or particularly when they have good things happen to them, then rather than being happy for them, we tend to be very jealous or have a lot of envy. And so then how to deal with that, similar to anger and attachment, first mindfulness, to just simply observe it, to cultivate that view of genuine happiness, and then to apply those antidotes of impermanence and emptiness, can help to overcome that jealousy and envy. Again, particularly this view of genuine happiness, that if we can really shift into that view of genuine happiness, you'll find that a lot of your mental afflictions will certainly, if not go away, they'll lose a lot of strength, because all of our mental afflictions are based on that view that the source of my happiness and source of my suffering is out there in the world. And so if we can shift that, then our mental afflictions will lose their strength and power. And then eventually, to cut them fully, we cut the root, which is this distorted view of reality. So the long-term strategy then would be this wisdom of emptiness, to really cultivate that fully. And if we can do that, then there's no basis for any sort of mental afflictions to arise. So that's empathetic joy. And now equanimity. Equanimity in Sanskrit is upeksha, and in Pali upekkha. And equanimity here is defined again as the wish or aspiration for ourselves and others to abide in equanimity, which is free of attachment and aversion to those near and far. So equanimity is an impartial, unbiased attitude towards others. Now we tend to be quite partial or biased, and we tend to categorize people into three groups simply from the perspective of how they seem to affect us. Those people around us who seem to support me in my happiness, we tend to label friends. Those people around us who don't seem to affect us in any way, we tend to label as strangers. And those people around us who seem to interfere with me and my happiness, and maybe even seem to cause me suffering, we tend to label as a so-called enemy. And then by categorizing people into those three groups, simply on that basis, we end up with attachment to friends because they seem to be the source of our happiness. We end up with apathy and indifference to strangers because I couldn't care less what happens to them because they're not affecting me in any way. And then we end up with often a lot of aversion, hostility, anger, even hatred to difficult people because they seem to be the source of our suffering. And so equanimity is about overcoming all of that. And we can begin to overcome that biased attitude by cultivating this understanding that we are all equal in wanting to be happy and wanting to be free of suffering. We're all equal in this regard. We're all stuck in the same situation. And then on that basis, to develop a sense of closeness to everyone because of that. And it's this equanimity which is really the basis for enabling us to expand our loving kindness, compassion, empathetic joy out to all living beings so that they're not biased or partial. And so equanimity is the basis for the other three, to expand out to all living beings. Similarly, with equanimity, we have some obstacles in terms of near enemy and far enemy. So the near enemy, what seems to be equanimity, but actually is polluting and corrupting it, is indifference or apathy. Because we can be equally indifferent or apathetic to everyone. And we go, well, I'm equally indifferent to everyone. I have equanimity. I couldn't care less what happens to anybody. That's equal, but that's not equanimity. It may seem like it, but it's actually polluting and corrupting it. And so the antidote to that is compassion. Because if we reflect on and look at the sufferings of others, it's difficult to remain indifferent or apathetic towards others. The far enemy of equanimity is simply attachment and aversion. And again, we've seen how to aversion in terms of also anger and so forth. And we've seen how to deal with those mental afflictions again in terms of mindfulness, the view of genuine happiness, and then applying antidotes. So that is very briefly equanimity. What we're going to do now is we're going to do a meditation on empathetic joy. Again, I won't go through this slide. These points are just there for you for later to understand that the points we went through in the meditation. So let's go straight to that practice now. So if you'd like to find a nice comfortable posture, let's begin. Setting the body into a state of relaxation, stillness, and vigilance. A vigilant posture is to simply keep the back nice and straight. And at the same time, allow the entire body to become completely relaxed. Relaxing and releasing any tightness or tension on each out-breath. Allowing the breathing to settle into its natural rhythm. Not trying to control or regulate the breath in any way. Simply allowing it to flow naturally and effortlessly. And setting the mind in a state of ease and relaxation. Simply allowing it to come to rest in the present moment. Resting in that open, spacious stillness of awareness. Empathetic joy is a rejoicing in our own and others' virtues and joys. And so first bring to mind a person who you know well, who radiates joy and well-being. And think about this person's physical presence, their words and their actions. And as you focus on this person's joy, open your heart to that joy and take delight in it. And now think of someone for whom something wonderful has happened recently. And recall the delight of that person and share in their joy. Now direct your attention to someone who inspires you with their virtues. Virtues such as generosity, kindness, and wisdom. And rejoice in these virtues, and for all of those who are recipients of this virtue. And not forgetting about yourself, that you've made effort to attend this weekend retreat, wanting to improve and develop yourself. So take joy in this. Now direct your attention back along the timeline of your life to your earliest childhood memories. And try to recall the earliest act of kindness that you can remember experiencing from another person. And take delight in this other person's kindness that they have shown you. And then slowly move along the timeline of your life from this earliest memory, moving slowly through your childhood years, adolescent years, adult years, right up to the present day. And recall all the people who were kind to you, helped you, and supported you in your life. And as you breathe out your delight and your gratitude that people have shown you such kindness, that they have brought such kindness to the world. And then release all appearances and allow the mind to come to rest in that inner purity of the mind, which is in the nature of empathetic joy. Rest in that joy. And we can bring the meditation to a close. Some tips for the practice. So what we've seen with each of these four immeasurables, they have what's called a near enemy, something which seems to be that quality, but actually it is corrupting or polluting it. Unfortunately, one of the other four immeasurables acts as the antidote. So what we saw there is that if we find that our loving kindness is simply degenerating into attachment, then to reflect on equanimity to overcome that attachment. Equanimity, if we find our equanimity is simply degenerating into being equally apathetic or indifferent to others, then it's a good time to reflect and cultivate compassion, because it's hard to remain indifferent when we're reflecting on the sufferings of others. But also sometimes compassion can degenerate into simply this state of despair. And often that happens is because we have this obsessive focus on the negative. So then that's a good time to reflect on the positives, to empathetic joy, to cultivate empathetic joy. And empathetic joy also can sometimes simply degenerate into rejoicing, into meaningless things, even harmful things. And if we see that, then that's a good time to cultivate loving kindness for ourselves and others to overcome that. So we see that then if we cultivate these four immeasurables as a package, then we can avoid, to a large extent, degenerating any of those qualities into the near enemies. And then last topic is we often talk about two supports for practice, that whatever practices we are doing, there are two things supporting that. And that in Buddhism, that's often called purification and accumulation. And purification is all about simply reducing our negative habits, and accumulation is about increasing positive habits. And reducing negative habits we can do through what's called the four opponent powers. And so therefore, if we have noticed we've done something harmful, to purify that habit in our mind, we can do four things. First, have sincere regret for having done that negative thing. So remember here, not to feel guilty about it, because if we're feeling guilty about it, we're doing the cognitive fusion. We're wrongly identifying ourselves with our negative behavior. So rather acknowledge, I've done this harmful thing, and have sincere regret for that. That's already weakening that negative habit. The second of the four opponent powers is what's called reliance, or sometimes translated as foundation. And that is to simply reaffirm that the positive direction in life, that now we all have a foundation, a direction that a positive direction that we're trying to follow in our life. If we've done something harmful, we've fallen down from that foundation. So this is about picking ourselves back up and simply reaffirming our positive direction in life, whatever that may be. A third thing we can do is remedy, is to think of some sort of practical remedy for the negative behavior we've done. For example, if we've verbally abused someone at work, a practical remedy simply is to apologize to that person. If we can't find something directly positive opposite, then any positive action with a motivation of wishing to overcome that negative habit can be effective. And the fourth thing we can do is resolve, is to make a strong determination not to repeat that negative behavior again. If it's a very strong habit, we need to be practical. No point in saying, I'm never going to do it again. That's not going to happen. So if it's something, so set a time limit if it's a very strong habit, and say for the next day, I'm not going to do that thing. If that's way too difficult, for the next hour, I'm not going to do that thing. If that's way too difficult, then for the next 5 minutes, I'm not going to do that thing. So pick an amount of time that with effort you can normally manage, and then over time you can extend from 5 minutes to an hour to a day, a week, a month, the rest of our life. And that way we can even start to break strong habits. So if we do these 4 opponent powers, whenever we've noticed we've done something harmful, then that's a very good way to purify that negative habit. And for positive thing we did, then the 2 things we do is if we've noticed we've done something wonderful, then to rejoice. Again, don't do cognitive fusion and praise ourselves. Rejoice about the behavior, that'll strengthen it. And then make a resolve, make a strong determination to continue to do that good behavior. Now, how we can apply this purification and accumulation in a practical way is we can do that at an end of day review. That at the end of every day, review our day. How did our day go? And pick one negative thing we did during the day and go through these 4 opponent powers with respect to that one thing. And then equally important, maybe even more important, to pick one good thing we did during the day and rejoice in that behavior and make a strong determination to continue that good behavior the following day. And then one further thing I think can be very helpful is that we often tend to take things for granted in our life. We are not grateful for the things we receive. So pick one thing you receive, and we receive so many things every day, and have a sense of gratitude for having received that thing. And if we do each of those 3 things and keep it very simple and short, this is a very powerful way to really reduce negative habits, increase positive habits, and have a sense of gratitude for the things that we receive in our life. So that's a few tips for the practice. So we've got a little bit of time for question answer now. So if anyone has any questions, then again, switch on the webcam and mic, or you can put it in the chat box and ask the questions. Anyone have a question? Who's first?
Yes. Hello, Glenn.
Ulrich, yes.
I would like to pick up the thread a little bit from yesterday. So it seems like all of these 4 immeasurables are not emotions, they're aspirations. And the same goes for the 3 poisons and all of the kleshas, they're also not emotions. So just to elaborate maybe a little bit on what we talked about yesterday, what is actually an emotion and what is actually the role of emotions in Buddhist philosophy? Because it seems like you mentioned something like empathy is an emotion, and love and joy, rejoicing is emotions. But what is actually that category that we call emotions? What does it mean in Buddhism?
Yeah, as far as I'm aware, I think in Tibetan, there actually is no word for emotion. It doesn't exist in Tibetan language. And so that, I think, sort of indicates something, because the Tibetan, certainly written language, is coming from Buddhism directly. There was no written language in Tibet when Buddhism came. So the written language in Tibet was formulated for writing down Buddhist teachings. So I find that interesting. I mean, I haven't looked at any historical reasons why that's maybe the case. But again, as I mentioned yesterday, I think it's really what we're talking about in Buddhist psychology is not so much the emotional displays that are important, but it's what's driving those emotional displays, what's underneath those emotional displays. Because, for example, we can have someone shouting and using very strong language, and then we often go, wow, they're really angry. But from a Buddhist perspective, maybe they're not angry. Maybe actually that's compassion. Because it depends, because, for example, let's say a young child is running across the road without looking, and the mother sees that. what will happen if she goes, "Oh, Johnny, please don't do that"? Do you think the child will take much notice? Probably not. Whereas if the mother uses very strong, maybe even very loud language to import to the child that it's dangerous to do that, you know, then the message may get across. And from a Buddhist perspective, even though maybe she's shouting and using strong language, probably underneath that, I mean, if underneath that she wants to hurt her child or something, then that's not okay. But generally she has the deep compassion for her child to help her child. And so that's the important thing. So then that would be compassion. That compassion is being displayed with very forceful words and language. So again, it's not so much it's important the surface level emotions that are displayed, but what's underneath that, what is driving those emotional outbursts or displays. That's the key here. And I think, as mentioned yesterday, that it really comes down to, and this is where we touched on a bit and we'll touch on more in Vipassana, is what is driving these emotions. Is it reality-based or is it delusional? Because if it's out of sync with reality, then we have a mental affliction driving that display. If it's reality-based, we will have things like loving kindness and compassion and so forth, and patience and so forth, will be driving the emotional display. So actually, yeah, that's so it's again what's underneath these emotions that is the key. What is the intention? What is the driving force behind them? Is it healthy or is it unhealthy? Is it reality based or is it not reality based? Does that sort of make sense, or am I missing something in your question?
It definitely makes sense. I'm just trying to wrap my head around the whole, because I think it says a lot about the whole paradigm, because we're used to also, like from popular culture, we're used to thinking about the meaning of it all being about this emotion, which is love, basically. And maybe from another paradigm, it's not all about this emotion that is so diffuse and so impossible really to find out what is. It's about an aspiration. So yeah. I'm still thinking about it, but thanks a lot. Again, it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. So, I mean, again, you know, I think love, if it's reality based, I mean, if we're talking about love as an emotion and maybe even some sort of intimate behavior, if that's reality based, that's wonderful. We need to increase that. But again, what's the key is what's driving that sort of intimate behavior. Is it reality? If it's reality based, it's very good. Increase. If it's not reality based, what that intimate behavior is, it's masking, it's just craving and attachment. And then it's all about me. What can I get out of this situation? And then actually that emotional behavior, that intimate behavior, is actually seeing the other person as an object to satisfy me. And that sort of intimate behavior is unhealthy. So it's not a matter of whether or not we should have intimate behavior. That's not the question. The question is, what is driving that intimate behavior? Is it reality-based? Is it healthy? Or is it out of sync with, is it ignorance? Is it delusion driving it? If it's delusion driving it, it's just going to create suffering. If it's reality-based, then it will be very helpful for both ourselves and others. Okay. We've still got time for another question. I think someone else put their hand up just before, after Ulrich. Who was that?
Hi, Glenn. Hi, everyone. I'm Cesare. So I wanted
Cesare, yes.
Yeah, I want to ask about the definition of empathetic joy, to be a bit kind of precise, understand clearly. So you said it's a wish, aspirations for ourselves and others to be never separated from happiness.
Yeah.
And also the rejoicing in our own and others' joys and virtues. So, but to me, when I cultivate these two, they kind of feel a bit different. So one is the aspiration and the other the rejoicing. So
yeah, exactly. So it's by exactly one, it's the aspiration for them never to be separated would then manifest as this rejoicing. So if we have the aspiration, if we wish ourselves and others never to be separated from happiness, and then we actually see ourselves and others have that happiness and do those virtues, then we'd be very happy about that. We would be rejoicing in that because that was our aspiration. So I think the aspiration would lead to that joy, that rejoicing. Does that make sense?
yes, yeah.
Okay.
Thanks.
We've got time for maybe one more question. Is there one in the chat somewhere, Martina?
Yes, there's a question from Anne. I'm going to read it out.
Sure.
So Anne says, anger is an emotion that I've learned to suppress very well.
Yes. Yeah.
Yet it has something positive because anger tells me something about a need that is not being honored, and therefore acts as a reminder to myself that I need to be more clear about my boundaries, for example. If this is the case, can we make space in the meditation for exploring the message of anger without dwelling in it nor expanding it?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, in fact, you know, particularly in the Lojong system of practice, we talk about taking adverse conditions into the path. And actually, these mental afflictions are challenging us, and they can actually be very helpful as long, of course, the condition is, the proviso is that we don't get caught up in them. If we get caught up in them, then they're just creating suffering for ourselves and others. But certainly, for example, you know, if everyone is always nice to us, how are we going to develop patience? Difficult. Whereas if we have people who are very nasty to us, then they're actually very helpful for us to develop patience, because we can have this illusion that I never get angry because the conditions, you know, everyone's nice to us around us, we go, wow, I'm really very patient sort of person, you know. Whereas if I never get angry anymore. Whereas if we have someone testing us, then we notice that anger, we go, oh, I still got a little bit of work to do. So yes, when mental afflictions come up, that's a very good opportunity. It's a bit of a reality check to highlight where we are in the path, because often, you know, if we can have this illusion that we're much further advanced than we really are. And when we come across these very difficult situations and we find that mental afflictions are arising, then it's a reality check to us to go, okay, I still need there's some more work to do here. I'm not actually as advanced as I thought I was. And then we can really learn from that. So, you know, we often hear in Lojong system of practice that, you know, we should see our worst enemy as our greatest teacher. So yes, we can learn from it, but as a beginner, if we can't manage to observe anger or other strong mental afflictions, if we just get caught up in them, then that situation is of no help. We can't learn from it because we have no capacity. All that will happen is we'll get caught up in it, we'll react, and our habit of getting angry will increase. So therefore, it's very much recommended as a beginner to not unnecessarily put ourselves in situations where we react in a very negative way, actually to protect ourselves a little bit from those situations so that we can start to develop ourselves, develop our capacity to be able to deal with anger better and better. And then when we come into these more difficult situations, we have more capacity to work with those mental afflictions and learn from those mental afflictions and go much further in the path. So yes, we can use those mental afflictions in that way. So that's a very good question. Okay, I think now it's time for a morning tea break. So let's take a break for 30 minutes. and we'll come back at 10:45. This is European time. For me, it's evening already. And we'll go into this exchanging self with others. So we'll build on these four immeasurables to another level. Here, particularly addressing this sort of selfish, self-centered attitude, how to transform that attitude. So that's what we'll look at in the next session. So, but let's take a break first, and I'll see you back in nearly half an hour's time. So enjoy your break.